Hello and welcome to my sewing room, where today I'm going to be making a high-waisted suspender skirt from an original pattern by DeBarry. But first of all, I was wondering, what was it that made grown women in the late 30s want to dress in an admittedly slightly more glamorous version of my school uniform, which also featured suspenders, sounds dodgy, but you know, suspenders over the shoulders and a skirt, admittedly in grey flannel, nothing very glamorous or attractive. So back to the late 30s and away from my school days, you'll be pleased to hear. A trend for this kind of high-waisted suspender skirt, which was mostly worn with a puff sleeve blouse, was such a popular look in the 30s. And where did it come from? It came from originally the Tyrol, or the traditional costume of the Tyrol region in Austria. And in fact, it was like dirndl style, as it's called, with the high waist, close-fitting bodice, full skirt, puffy sleeve blouse. It was very much a traditional folk costume of Germany and Austria. So how did it come to translate into a fashion trend? First of all, I think we look to 1936 when the Trapp family performed in Salzburg in traditional Tyrolean costume, and yes, the Trapp family, von Trapp family, later popularized in The Sound of Music. They were a real family. And then in 1937 the film Heidi was released, starring Shirley Temple, and of course Heidi, a famous children's heroine in her alpine traditional costume. And then most famous of all, Snow White, also the Disney film Snow White in 1937, the princess with the fewest changes of costume. She only had two, and both of them, her kind of rags costume and her more glamorous smart costume, totally reflects this 1930s trend for the dirndl look. She's got her puff sleeves, her close-fitting bodice, her full skirt. I forgot the apron. The apron would be a part of this look. And in fact, if you, I don't know how true this is actually, but if you tied your apron with a knot on the right or the left, I can't remember which one is which, but one side meant you were single and available, and the other side meant you were married. Back to Snow White. So Snow White has been criticised for, whilst taking place in the 16th century, of course the Disney Snow White looks completely 1930s. She looks very much like Vivian Leigh or Claudette Colbert or Hedy Lamarr. Her second costume is kind of a little kind of nod to the Renaissance, with her stand-up collar and her slash sleeves with the colour coming through. But in that the 1930s loved a decorative sleeve and decorative collar, you know. So these were the happy influences behind the adoption of this style. The darker influences behind its popularization lie in these were the years leading up to the Second World War, and the Women's League of the Nazi Party in Germany were very keen on popularizing the Germanic traditional folk costume worn by women as a kind of feminine ideal. And Jewish people were actually banned from participating in any folk tradition, despite having contributed to it. Actually, this led to the spread of the influence of this look, because many fled Germany in the years before the war and fled to America, and took their cultural influences with them. And this look absolutely took off in America. It was incredibly popular, and I found this wonderful picture of Gloria Swanson with Marion Davis and Constance Bennett, and the instantly recognizable Jean Harlow wearing this kind of very Tyrolean look. So having looked at a quintessential late 30s look, I'm going to get on and make my own high-waisted suspender skirt with a baby cord fabric from Liberty of London, really pretty floral fabric, and I chose it because I want this to be a really wearable daytime dress. And I chose to make it on my lovely Singer hand crank sewing machine. I'm cutting out the pattern pieces. There are 7 in all. The centre front and centre back, which are cut on the fold, side panels for the skirt, and facing pieces. I've pinned the panels of the skirt front together and the skirt back together. And now I'm going to stitch them. Very therapeutic using this lovely hand crank machine. It's my homemade pincushion from a half doll. And now I'm laying these centre front and centre back pieces together before pinning the sides and stitching them together. So the centre front, as you can see, is quite high. And this is the facing piece for it, which follows the curve at the top. And I've stitched that to the back facing piece, and then that is reinforced with interfacing, and the edge is machine stitched in place, and then the facing stitch to the main skirt too, and then that's given a press and turned to the inside. And I'm just tacking the zip into the left side of the skirt. And the dogs are finding this particularly thrilling. And then I'm machine stitching the zip into place and leaving the needle in to turn at the corners. And there we are, zip all ready. And I'm marking the buttonholes with tailor tacks, measuring the size of the button. I'm going to make a bound buttonhole, so I'm marking the measurements. For a proper tutorial on this, I really recommend Retro Claude's tutorial. It's measuring the size of the button to fit through. Cutting my patches for the bound buttonhole, and I've marked where I'll stitch with little running stitches. Then I'm pinning on the patches, and I'll stitch around the edges, the machine around the buttonhole, leaving the needle in at the corners to turn. And then cutting through the centre line with my buttonhole tool, and you have to cut into each corner of the buttonhole really carefully. If you cut into the stitching, you nearly definitely can't save it. And I'm now taking out the little running stitches. What you want to do is, from the right side, you literally with your fingers press from the right side through to the wrong side. So that's the right side, and then we're just pressing the fabric patch through the hole like this, and then once it's through, you basically keep manipulating with your fingers until you're getting like a nice sort of crisp rectangle like this. Reinforce the corners and then stitch the patch invisibly to the machine stitching buttonhole. So I'm just taking the needle through, just through the stitching here. You can see just through the stitching there. So I've folded over each suspender and I'm stitching each right sides together. Then I'm marking the buttonhole with pins so that I can see the edges of or the corners of the buttonhole on the facing side. Then I'm taking my seam ripper and I'm not starting at the very edge because I want to create my little triangles, but I'm just starting here, you can see, and clipping through very gingerly. So on this side now I can clip to here and then clip into the corners there and there. Be so careful because you do not want to catch any of the fabric below. So there we are. And take my pins out. What I need to do is fiddle this. You can often use a pin just to tuck under the edges of the facing and slip stitch those edges, and then that's slip stitch to the machine stitch line along here. And that's my finished buttonhole. And the excitement seems to have finished off the dogs. Bound buttonholes have been just too thrilling for them to cope with. And just hemming the skirt to finish. And my high-waisted suspender skirt is ready, and I think it's really cute. I'm modelling out in the garden as usual. I'm wearing a 1930s beaded headdress, which is in keeping with the period of the dress. And here come my usual garden friends. And you might be able to spot 2 more of them on their way. Thank you so much for joining me on another sewing adventure. I can't tell you how comfortable this suspender skirt is. Nothing tight around the tummy, which is always good. And they're a lovely way to show off a pretty blouse. Like, this is a true vintage 1930s blouse, which is in keeping with the suspender skirt itself. So thank you so much for joining me on my latest sewing adventure. Please subscribe and like, and I'll look forward to seeing you next Friday. Bye. Waiting for the dog to stop barking. She stopped? No, still barking. Still barking. And still barking.